Okay, one thing that I forgot to mention in the last lecture that happens right when Socrates starts talking to Thrasymachus. When Thrasymachus gets angry and Socrates says, Thrasymachus, don't be angry. We just don't know. I'm confused. If you know better, you should show pity. You shouldn't get angry at us. And that's when Thrasymachus says, Heracles, here is that habitual irony of Socrates. Socratic irony, usually whenever you use the word irony, there's sort of different contexts, different usages for the word irony. Usually it means that there is some kind of a disparity or a gap between the appearance and the reality, or between the way that something seems to one person and the way that it really is. Dramatic irony, the end of Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is taking a sleeping potion. Romeo thinks that she's actually dead. The audience knows that she's not, but Romeo thinks that she is, so he kills himself. That's dramatic irony, where things appear one way to the people in the play, but the audience knows that they're actually different. But they appear a certain way. That's the irony. Sometimes irony can just mean sarcasm. If you say, "Yeah, that's great," and you don't really think it's great, that's irony. Socrates, when of course, Socratic irony is basically kind of pretending to be, as Thrasymachus puts it, kind of pretending to be dumb, pretending to be less than you are. As if here, Socrates, rather than saying, "Okay, Thrasymachus, I'll tell you what justice is," instead he pretends like, "I don't know, don't get angry, I don't know what's going on, I'm trying my best, Thrasymachus, please be nice, help." Thrasymachus, this is nonsense, this is this Socratic irony. And he is able to predict to the people, he says, "I predicted to the men sitting here that this is exactly what you would do." So Thrasymachus apparently knows Socrates well enough to be able to predict how he's going to act. Obviously, here in the Republic, they appear mainly as antagonists. They're basically fighting back and forth, but there are various kind of small comments here and there, like this one, that indicate that they know each other fairly well, and that they even kind of know what to expect from each other. So Socratic irony, kind of pretending to be dumber than you actually are, pretending to be less than you are. Again, another sign of how Socrates is less concerned with kind of conventional respect and honor than Thrasymachus. He's willing to play dumb. He's willing to be pretend to be less impressive than he actually is. Though again, Thrasymachus doesn't believe that he's actually not concerned with honor. He just thinks it's kind of a dishonest way to go about trying to impress people, pretending to be dumb and then asking questions and sort of tearing them apart. Thrasymachus, it's not manly. Rather than sort of meeting the challenge and going head on, Socrates prefers to play dumb, to be ironic, and this irritates Thrasymachus. So then they go through the rest of the discussion, the things that we talked about in the last lecture. And then, so finally, Socrates says Thrasymachus pretended like he didn't want to talk. It was obvious that he did. He thought he would make a good show, win a good reputation among people, impress everybody. But he pretended like he wanted to. He put on this show. Finally, they convinced him to, and he said, here's the wisdom of Socrates. He learns from others, but won't pay, won't even say thank you. And Socrates says, well, when you say I learned from others, that's definitely true. But he says, when you say I don't say thanks, then you're lying. I thank people, and I'm sure I'll thank you in a minute, because I'm sure you'll speak well. And Thrasymachus says, well, okay, here's my definition of justice. And he says, I say that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Now, why don't you praise me? And he said, but you won't be willing. So, a little needy here. And he just gives a kind of one-line answer and instantly wants praise. So calm down. And Socrates replies in this way that must be extremely irritating for Thrasymachus, especially after Thrasymachus has just denounced him for this irony and all of this. Socrates plays very dumb and asks this question, what do you mean, Thrasymachus, the advantage of the stronger? You mean if somebody is physically strong and eating a lot of beef is good for their body, and that's what gives them this physical strength, that's what justice is and it would also be good for those of us who are weaker than him. That's what justice is eating a lot of beef. And obviously Thrasymachus is extremely irritated by this. He says, Socrates, you're disgusting. It's sort of, again, Socrates doing exactly what Thrasymachus seems to find most irritating. Thrasymachus replies in the way you would expect, with irritation, dismissiveness. But there's kind of a serious point here. Even though they don't pursue it here, there's a possible suggestion of an actual serious idea about justice. As often in the Platonic dialogues, things might be hinted at or just kind of very, very faintly sketched or kind of alluded to. And you can think about it, but it's not necessarily pursued in the actual dialogue itself. But you could see this as illustrating or suggesting a serious point about justice. Maybe justice is simply the instrumental. Maybe it's simply the means to the end of whatever is good. If strength is good, justice is whatever makes you strong. So in this simple case, if strength is good, if physical strength is good, and eating a lot of beef, I mean, that's obviously only part of it. You can eat a lot of beef and not necessarily be strong, and quite the opposite. But if that's part of it, and if eating beef is part of what makes you physically strong, then maybe that's justice. If strength is good, maybe justice is whatever makes you strong. If physical strength is good and eating beef makes you physically strong, then maybe justice is eating beef. If political strength is good, maybe justice is whatever makes you politically strong. If wisdom is what's good, maybe justice is whatever makes you wise. They don't really pursue this idea here. Socrates maybe kind of hints at it, but Thrasymachus gets angry. They move on, and Thrasymachus explains what he actually means by the advantage of the stronger. He basically says, he sort of points out, first of all, that there are these different types of regimes. So the different cities in ancient Greece had different forms of government. Some were democracies, the many people, the majority would make the laws. Others were oligarchies, smaller, usually the very wealthy. Smaller group would make the laws. Some were tyrannies, just one person would make the law for the entire city. And of course, today we tend to think of democracy as being really the key to legitimacy. That if a city or if a country is democratic, its laws are automatically legitimate. If it's not, then their laws are automatically not legitimate. Among the ancient Greeks, obviously, they saw there were different types of cities, even in Greece itself, and they didn't necessarily think that one was obviously right and the others were obviously completely wrong. And so Thrasymachus is saying, look, again, you can see, you look, you see these different types of cities. What you see is they have different laws. A democracy makes laws. Well, what kind of laws? Laws to benefit the majority. Laws to benefit the people, the people as a political class. Oligarchy, the few very wealthy making the laws, they make laws to benefit themselves, again, as a group. A tyranny where one person makes the laws, he's making laws just to benefit himself as an individual. Some of this was sort of later developed by Aristotle. He sort of talked about the different regimes, the different groups of people who can make the law, and in like much of Aristotle's thought, he sort of developed something that might seem commonsensical and kind of developed it, articulated it into a philosophical position, and said the key to a form of government being just or legitimate isn't how many people are making the laws. It's not what type of government they have in terms of who's making the laws or how many of them there are. The key is whether or not the laws aim at the common good. So are the laws sort of trying to achieve the good of the city as a whole, or are they clearly aimed at the private good of the people making the laws? Again, whether it's the majority of the people in a democracy or just one person in a tyranny, if the laws are trying to do what's best for the city as a whole, that's just. If it's aiming at the private good of the people who make the laws, that's unjust. That's illegitimate. That's incorrect, as Aristotle says. And Thrasymachus is basically saying that never in any type of city do you have people making the laws for the common good. The people in power always make laws to benefit themselves. Again, in a democracy, the fact that the majority is are making the laws, that doesn't make the laws legitimate or just or anything like that. It doesn't make them for the common good. It makes them for the good of the class, the majority who are making the laws. So he says, every type of city has different laws depending on the people who are making them. But in every city, it's the rulers, the stronger, as he puts it, who are making the laws, and they make the laws for their own advantage. So he's clearly saying that there are no laws for the common good. And he's also sort of going back and saying, Socrates, what you and Polemachus were just talking about, what you were looking for, justice is some kind of virtue or is some sort of good thing that you seek out because it's good, that doesn't exist. Justice is simply the law, and the law is simply made to benefit the people in power who are the ones who are actually making the law. So remember, Cephalus sort of said justice is basically just the law. Polemachus, there was a bit of an assent, as he said the justice is somehow connected to the good. And now, Thrasymachus is still saying justice is connected to the good, but simply the good of the people making the laws. And he goes back to saying justice is basically just the law. Justice is basically just whatever the people in power command, and the people in power command what's good for them. So, his basic point here is sort of relatively clear. It's kind of a cynical argument. Society is basically just a system of exploitation. The people who make the laws simply make it to benefit themselves in a private, selfish way. As he puts it later, they benefit themselves and not other people. The person who thinks that they're being just and obeys the law, in fact, is doing someone else's good and not their own. So he sees, just as he sees this conversation as kind of a competition, he sees society in much the same way. Society is a competition between different groups, and the group, whoever it is who's making the law, is benefiting at the expense of everybody else. They're sort of winning in the competition, and you can see how this is probably one of the first lessons. Again, Thrasymachus, a sophist, someone who goes around and teaches how to succeed in politics through speaking and so on, but probably even more than that, or maybe before that, he says, well, what is politics? And politics is basically just, again, a kind of a system of exploitation. So the first thing you want to do is identify where you are in this system, and get into a position where you're one of the people benefiting, one of the people doing the exploiting, rather than one of the people being exploited. And so again, you can kind of see what he's arguing here, and you can see the force of what he's saying, which he comes back to again and again as Socrates creates problems. And notice that Socrates doesn't say, "Oh, not here in Athens, Thrasymachus." He doesn't defend Athens. He doesn't really sort of try to challenge or disagree with the cynical thrust of what Thrasymachus is saying. Instead, he asks, kind of typically for Socrates, he asks for clarification, and he says, "Well, okay, so justice is whatever those in power command, whatever the people in power tell the other people to do. That's what justice is. The law. Justice is simply whatever people in power command." And the people in power command what is good for them. Therefore, justice is the advantage of the stronger. Or, people in power command what is to their advantage. Therefore, justice is the advantage of the stronger. And he says, okay, but Thrasymachus, rulers, are they such as ever make mistakes? Do rulers make mistakes about their own advantage? And, Thrasymachus says, well, of course. I mean, if you try to say no one in a position of power has ever made a mistake, that would be absurd. So, of course, he says, yes, of course, the people rulers make mistakes. And then Socrates says, well, in that case, if they make mistakes about what their advantage is, then sometimes their commands will actually be to their disadvantage. As Polemachus puts it at 340b, the advantage of the stronger would be no more just than the disadvantage in this case. So in other words, if justice is simply doing whatever the people in power command, and they want to command what is to their advantage, but sometimes they make mistakes, then if justice is simply whatever the people in power command, sometimes they're commanding what is actually good for them, sometimes they're commanding things that are actually ultimately bad for them. So when Saddam Hussein gave the order to invade Kuwait in 1991, clearly he thought that would be good for him. Having his army destroyed, having no-fly zones and so on imposed, that was probably not so good. When Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union, again, it didn't actually go well for him. So these would be examples in that case. What the ruler was commanding was not actually to the advantage of the ruler. And Socrates is saying, okay, if you're saying that justice is simply whatever the ruler commands, and sometimes you allow that sometimes the rulers make mistakes, then sometimes justice will be the advantage of the stronger, sometimes it will be the disadvantage of the stronger, depending on whether or not the ruler has been correct. And Thrasymachus kind of realizes this, and he falls silent as Socrates explains. Polemachus bursts in. Then Cleitophon, who seems to be kind of maybe one of Thrasymachus' students or clients or something like that. Cleitophon is a little slow on the uptake. Polemachus has to kind of explain it for him and make it clear. But that's useful. And again, as he puts it, the advantage of the stronger would be no more just than the disadvantage if justice is simply whatever the people in power command. And sometimes they're right about their advantage, sometimes they're mistaken, then sometimes justice will actually be the advantage of the stronger. And justice, in other words, what the people in power are commanding, what the law is saying, sometimes that will be the advantage of the stronger, sometimes it will be the disadvantage. And Cleitophon sort of says, Cleitophon understands this in a particular way and says, well, but that's, again, it takes him a while to catch up, but when he does, he says, that's because the advantage of the stronger, as he puts it, is what the stronger believes to be his advantage. This is what must be done by the weaker, and this is what Thrasymachus set down as justice. So Cleitophon says that the advantage of the stronger is simply whatever the stronger believes to be his advantage. Now, there are two ways to understand this. One, as a simple he could be saying, look, this can easily be taken care of. It's a simple matter of clarifying definitions. Justice is simply whatever the stronger believes to be his advantage. So again, justice is simply the law, and we don't have to debate that's clear enough. Whatever the people in power command, that's what justice is, but this isn't confusing. Or he could be going further and making a kind of relativistic argument that the advantage of the stronger, the good for the stronger, is whatever they believe to be good, whatever they believe to be their advantage. And there is no kind of independent good. There is no good that exists independently of the way that it seems to people or what people believe is to their advantage. So it could be a kind of relativistic argument where you're saying, well, people in power believe what they believe, and you can't really say that they're mistaken or not. They simply believe that something is good, and that's what they command, and that's all that justice is. Now, Thrasymachus then Socrates, Polemachus says, oh, well, that's not what he said, and Socrates says, never mind, we'll accept this from him now. Is that what you meant, Thrasymachus? And Thrasymachus is actually fairly contemptuous of this idea. That what he meant was that justice is simply whatever the stronger believes to be to his advantage. He says, do you think I call somebody stronger at the very moment when they're making a mistake? So he's in particular especially contemptuous of this idea that the good is simply whatever it seems to be to somebody, that whatever somebody believes is their advantage, that is their advantage. Saying, no, clearly, when you make a disastrous political advantage, that was not good. You could never try to argue that that was actually to your advantage. If you are unjust on a personal level and you try to double cross somebody and they kill you, you could never say, well, it seemed to be good to him, therefore it was good for him. No, that was a mistake. Somebody made this decision and they ended up dead, and that was not good for them, even if it did seem like it was good to them when they made the decision. Clearly they were wrong. That wasn't good. So Thrasymachus is kind of contemptuous of this and says, and he introduces this idea that we'll talk about in a second, of a ruler in the precise sense. But the other thing that's going on here is psychologically, Socrates, by identifying this problem for Thrasymachus, kind of says, okay, Thrasymachus, what do you actually respect more? Which do you really take more seriously? Simple strength, simple power, or actual knowledge? So in other words, when we see that sometimes people in power make mistakes, which side are you sort of going to come down on? The side of saying, well, they're still in power and you still have to do whatever they say, so it doesn't matter if they make mistakes or not. They're the ones with the power. Or do you say, as he says, I don't think that somebody's strong when they're making a mistake. Saddam Hussein, Hitler, these guys may have been brutal enough to grab onto power and even to hold on to power for a while. But ultimately, they destroyed themselves, they destroyed their countries, they made them much weaker. These people were not strong. They might have had power for a little bit, but that doesn't make them strong because they didn't know what they were doing. They were fools, they made all kinds of mistakes, they believed all kinds of stupid things. Somebody like Castro in Cuba, who is... Just ask Ozzie Guillen, someone like Castro in Cuba, who has been there for 40 years, right next to one of the most powerful country in the hemisphere. It's not that he's as strong as the United States, but he's managed to hold on to power. Why? Thrasymachus would say, because he knows what he's doing. That's somebody who's strong, not because he has the same amount of political or military power as the United States, but because even though they want to get rid of him, he can hold on to power. Tito in Yugoslavia. Kind of stuck between two superpowers, overshadowed by one, but he was able to hold on and rule for decades. Why? Not because he was the strongest in the sense of having the biggest army or the most people doing whatever he said, but because he really ruled on the basis of knowledge and therefore understood how to hold on to power. And Thrasymachus is saying that's who I'm saying is the stronger, not just whoever has power and is telling other people what to do and threatening them, but someone who actually knows what they're doing. And as he puts it, that's the ruler in the precise sense. And so what does that mean? He says, basically he says, obviously every actual human being who's doing anything will make a mistake. A mathematician might get tired, might get distracted, might just stop paying attention for some reason, and will make a mistake. But he says a mathematician in the precise sense, someone who really knows mathematics and is applying mathematics when they're solving these problems, he says that person never makes a mistake. Again, in the precise sense, when we talk about a mathematician, or as he puts it, a calculator, in the precise sense, we're talking about someone who is acting on the basis of knowledge. And insofar as they're acting on the basis of knowledge, they never make a mistake. The actual human beings who know math and try to solve math problems will inevitably make mistakes. A doctor is another example. A doctor, might make mistakes. A doctor might get arrogant, and she may make mistakes, misdiagnoses, because she thinks that she knows more than she does. She stops sort of applying her art and begins making decisions based on other personal motives. So actual doctors will make mistakes, but Thrasymachus says a doctor in the precise sense is someone who knows exactly what she knows and knows exactly what her knowledge tells her about a situation and applies that knowledge. And if it's clear, if she can make a good diagnosis on the basis of that, then she does. But if she realizes, I don't know enough here to really make a solid diagnosis, then she won't. She won't be carried away by other emotions or motivations or anything like that. So he says, a knower, someone who really knows, or as he puts it, a craftsman in the precise sense, is someone who acts solely on the basis of knowledge. And he says it's the same with a ruler. A ruler in the precise sense is not someone who makes mistakes. Again, all rulers will actually make mistakes. But he says in the sense that I mean this, a ruler in the precise sense is not someone who makes mistakes, who does dumb things, who gets carried away by his own sense of power and makes terrible mistakes. A ruler in the precise sense is someone who governs on the basis of knowledge and therefore never makes mistakes. Okay? And again, this is an interesting idea. It's an interesting terminological distinction or wrinkle that he introduces. And obviously, this would, what justice would mean in practice would be a little bit messier, but he's sort of, again, sticking with the clarifying his position and, again, saying what I really respect here is knowledge, and in particular, knowledge of how to rule. And so he basically says, a rule in the precise sense never makes mistakes, and Socrates basically accepts this, but as he goes on then he says, okay, but every art, after all, every kind of knowledge doesn't actually look to the good of the practitioner. It looks to the good of the art itself, to be as perfect as possible. So he says, a mathematician then, in the precise sense, isn't someone who's looking to benefit himself as a mathematician, somebody who's embezzling money and doctoring account books in order to make that happen. That's obviously not a mathematician in the precise sense. It's someone who knows mathematics, maybe, if they're getting away with it. But that's not someone that's not a mathematician or a calculator in the precise sense. So Socrates says, a mathematician in the precise sense has no interest as a mathematician except to make his art as perfect as possible, to know mathematics as well as he can, and to solve these problems as perfectly as he can. And of course, ruling is a little bit more like medicine. So he says, medicine, the art of medicine in the precise sense, a doctor in the precise sense, obviously you go to an individual doctor, he could give you a false diagnosis in order to make money off of it. He could tell you that you have a disease that you don't have, and say that you have to have an expensive surgery or prescribe drugs that you don't really need, because it will make money for him in some way. But that's obviously not a doctor in the precise sense. A doctor in the precise sense will, again, be concerned with practicing her art in the best way. Who will be concerned with as Socrates puts it, making her art as perfect as possible, understanding medicine as well as possible. But unlike mathematics, medicine isn't a purely abstract. It's not the science of biology. It's the art of medicine, and the art of medicine is concerned with an individual's health. So a doctor in the precise sense is someone who is trying to make her patients as healthy as possible. When she practices medicine, she's not doing it to benefit herself. She's doing it to benefit the people who are sort of the objects of that art, the people who are under the care of that art. So a doctor in the precise sense is concerned with the health of the patients. And Socrates says, and it would be the same with a ruler. A ruler in the precise sense is not someone who's benefiting himself. It's not someone who's embezzling from public funds, and that's not a ruler in the precise sense. A ruler in the precise sense is someone who is governing on the basis of knowledge and making that knowledge as perfect as possible. Okay, but then what are they actually doing? They're ruling a city, and that means that ultimately they're looking towards the good of the city. That again, if we talk about ruling in the precise sense, we're talking about someone who's devoted to their art and only their art, and therefore isn't benefiting. And their art, in fact, the art of ruling, is directed towards taking care of the city, benefiting the city. Okay, and obviously Thrasymachus has, again, sort of refuted at a loss momentarily, but then he comes back and he actually gets quite angry and has quite the response for Socrates.